So the goal of today's class is going to be to introduce you to the topics of privacy and think about some of the important questions that AI-powered technologies raise for the ethics of privacy. So as Gretchen said, I'm focusing on intimate privacy, but today we're just going to talk about privacy more generally. So we're going to break the class up into two parts. Firstly, we're going to have a bit of a 101 on privacy, so thinking about what privacy is and why we might think privacy is valuable. Then we're going to turn to the problems that AI raises for privacy. Okay, so one of the major challenges in the philosophy of privacy is explaining what privacy is. So there are many different contexts in which it might be claimed that we have a right to privacy. There are also many different scenarios in which an individual might be described as having lost privacy. So to get this project in mind, let's start by thinking about a series of cases in which it seems intuitive that some individual has lost a measure of privacy. So in this case, the individual in question, we're going to call Simon. So first case, Heidi steals Simon's diary. Second case, private information about Simon is leaked online. Simon discloses medical information to his doctor. And finally, a prospective employer purchases private information about Simon to assess whether or not they're the kind of candidate he wants to hire. So in each of these cases, it seems intuitive that Simon has lost a measure of privacy. And the challenge for those working in the philosophy of privacy is to explain why. And it's worth noting that even though there might be a loss of privacy in these cases, only some of them will constitute kind of a wrongful loss or a violation of the right to privacy. So we can think of an account of privacy in two parts. Firstly, we need to explain the object of privacy, so what kinds of things we can lose privacy over. And then we need to explain what a privacy loss is. So what it means to have or lack privacy over the object of privacy. So the reason why we need to say what the object of privacy is that not all cases in which other people learn information about us seem to be about privacy. So instead, privacy seems to only concern information which is personal or sensitive. So most accounts of privacy start from this idea that there are facts about us that we don't want other people to know. So personal information being the kind of information we don't disclose and information we only disclose to family and friends. It includes information that most people don't want widely known, the kind of information we fear anyone accessing without our permission. So a more concrete definition of this is the kind of information about ourselves that people in a certain society have reason not to want anyone other than themselves, and sometimes a very limited number of other people chosen by them to know about. So we can think about personal information as information which could be used to harm us, or which the concealment of provides various benefits. And we'll come to these when we're discussing the value of privacy shortly. So it's worth noting that today we're just going to focus on informational privacy. That is the kind of privacy we have over personal information. But sensitive or personal information might not exhaust the object of privacy. So many privacy theorists argue that privacy is about more than just information. So it can also concern the ways in which other people can hear, smell, or touch us in the absence of informational gain. So to motivate this, we can consider the following case. So suppose that you come to my house for dinner, and at the end of the evening, you say goodbye and walk out the door. But instead of returning home, you turn the corner and peer through my window. So assuming that I don't drastically change anything about what I'm wearing, anything in my surroundings, what I'm doing, it seems plausible that you gain no new information about me. But then it still seems intuitive that I've suffered a privacy loss with respect to you. So just to note that informational privacy might only be a subset of all privacy concerns. Okay, so now we have the object of privacy in mind, we're going to turn to accounts of informational privacy. So there are many, many different accounts of what informational privacy is. We're not going to have time to go through each of these accounts, but for those of you who are interested, I can send some helpful literature after the session. Today, I'm just going to briefly outline two competing accounts, so the control account and the access account. So the control account is the dominant theory of informational privacy, and it states that individuals possess privacy when they can control when, how, and to what extent other people know information about them. Then a violation of privacy happens when that control is taken away without consent. So There's some ambiguity in how we're to understand the notion of control here. So we can differentiate two kinds of control that might be relevant for the control account. On the one hand, the relevant kind of control might be control over the initial revelation of information. So in the case of Heidi stealing Simon's diary, Simon seems to lack privacy because he lacks control over whether or not Heidi reads his diary. So it's not up to him whether or not she learns the information within it. Whereas in the case of Simon disclosing medical information to his doctor, we might think that he retains privacy because the way in which his doctor knows sensitive information about him is within his control. The second kind of control is control over downstream disclosures. So Ines seems to adopt this notion of control when she describes exercising control as an ongoing process which consists in far more than simply initiating the situation. So it requires being able to regulate or halt the progression of that information being disseminated, as well as some kind of certainty that that ability will be retained in the future. So this is kind of a more stringent notion of control. So going back to the case of Simon disclosing medical information to his doctor, one reason we might think that he nevertheless retains privacy in that case is because downstream access to that information is partly protected by norms of confidentiality. Okay, so with this control account very briefly in mind, we're going to look at some counterexamples which put pressure on the idea that privacy is exclusively about control. So the first counterexample, suppose that my neighbor develops a minuscule drone, and that any time they could turn on the drone and use it to spy on me. So under the control account, it seems that the mere existence of the drone diminishes my privacy. And that's because I lack control over what extent my neighbor knows information about me. But it seems as though even though the drone is outside of my control, my privacy isn't lost simply because they've acquired the power to invade my privacy. And this suggests that there can be a loss of control without a loss of privacy. Okay, second counterexample. Suppose that I accidentally drop a waterproof hard drive into the ocean and then it sinks to the bottom of the ocean floor. In this case, the contents of the drive seem to remain private, even though access to the drive isn't controlled by me or anyone else. So again, in this case, we seem to lack control but retain privacy, which suggests that control is not necessary for the possession of privacy, contra the control account. So in both of these cases, it seems intuitive to say that privacy is lost only when my neighbor succeeds in using the drone to spy on me, or in the event that someone finds and accesses the drive. So Thompson puts this, which applies more to the case of the drone, but is the actual looking that violates rather than the acquisition of the power to look. So these kinds of counterexamples to the control account have led some people towards the access account. So the access account argues that actual access is necessary for privacy loss. So we lose privacy with respect to a bit of information on another person when that person accesses information to us, whether by reading, seeing, or hearing, understanding that information. So when Simon tells the doctor sensitive medical information, he on the access account loses privacy because the doctor learns information about him. And in the case where Heidi possesses Simon's diary, Simon only loses privacy over that information when Heidi reads and understands the contents of the diary. So mere possession of information without access doesn't constitute privacy loss for the access account. So the difference between the control and access account can be put as follows. So whereas for the control account, it's our ability to manage boundaries to access, which constitute the possession of privacy. For the access theory, these boundaries are means of protecting privacy rather than what constitutes privacy. So we're now going to consider one counterexample to the access account. So Heidi and Simon are having dinner at a restaurant, and Simon recounts the personal story. Heidi cautions that they have no privacy. Now, in this case, if no one in fact listens to the conversation, then under the access account, Simon would retain privacy. But it also seems intuitive to think that Simon has no privacy because anyone could listen in at any time. So in this case, it seems like Simon has diminished privacy despite the lack of access, which suggests that access is not necessary for privacy loss against the access account. So we've given reasons for doubting that both the control account and the access account capture all there is to privacy. So one question is, where do we go from here? So some people have suggested adopting hybrid accounts of privacy, under which both aspects of control and aspects of access are important in defining what privacy is. Other people have adopted reductionist accounts, so they've begun to question whether there's anything unified about the right to privacy. So Thompson famously adopts this position and argues that the right to privacy is just a cluster of other rights, so it can be explained in terms of other interests, and the term privacy is in some sense vacuous. Okay, so with these kind of two ways of understanding privacy in mind, we're going to turn to thinking about why we might value privacy. So I'm going to list a load of interests that might explain the value of privacy, but this isn't meant to be exhaustive. So the first important reason why we might value privacy is that it protects us from harm. So there's this common idea that the more someone knows about us, the more vulnerable we are to them. So people with sensitive information can embarrass us, they can blackmail us. You could think about how you're more vulnerable to your friends versus strangers, partly in virtue of the fact that they know more about you. The second reason why we might value privacy has to do with self-presentational control. So self-presentational interests are interests in having a measure of control over which aspects of ourselves we reveal to others, whether our bodies, our thoughts, or how we style our appearances. So self-presentational control is crucial for managing social relationships, and some of these depend on concealment of information. So, for example, there's information that it would be appropriate for me to reveal to my partner or my best friend, but it wouldn't be appropriate for me to reveal to my strangers. And in fact, to students. And students knowing certain information about me might in fact compromise teacher-student relationship. Other relationships kind of depend on the concealment of information to avoid unnecessary conflicts, such as the dislike of an antiquated relative or one's true feelings about their boss. Another value of privacy is that it provides us with drafting spaces. So privacy gives us an experimental, judgment-free zone in which we can explore things like fears and fantasies, process our emotions, and decide when and to whom we invite ourselves to social scrutiny. Another value of privacy is that it's crucial to managing our reputations. And this is the case even if we've done nothing wrong. So it's sometimes said that privacy is only valuable to those who have something to hide. But in some sense, it seems like we all have something to hide, whether that's a bad joke that could be taken out of context, a soppy love letter, bank details, or a photograph of you drunk. Another value of privacy is that it can help to promote equality. So personal information can be used to discriminate against people in ways that undermine equality. And by preventing other people from treating us differently on account of our identity, privacy can help to promote equality. It also protects our autonomy, which roughly speaking is the ability to govern ourselves. So for example, there's well-documented evidence that when we know other people are watching us, we can be pushed to act how others want us to act, rather than how we ourselves want to act. Privacy also has an important role to play in the development of intimate relationships. And finally, privacy is good for our well-being. So having private spaces can save us from feelings of embarrassment and negative self-consciousness. So for example, when we undress, when we sing, when we have sex. And privacy allows us in this sense to relax and switch off. Okay, so far we've talked about personal information, so the object of informational privacy. We've considered two competing dominant accounts of privacy, the access account and the control account, and we've considered some reasons why human beings might value privacy. We're now going to turn to some of the problems that AI raises for privacy. So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, data collection, the problem of aggregation, and then think about how consent might function online. Then we're going to end with some reflections of what we might do to protect privacy online. So one thing to keep in mind here is that the problems that AI poses for privacy are often not new problems. So they tend to be variations of old privacy problems, but AI changes these privacy problems in unique ways and exacerbates them. So first, let's briefly define what we mean by artificial intelligence. So roughly, AI refers to the development of computer systems that can perform tasks typically requiring human intelligence. So AI involves a wide spectrum of technologies, from virtual assistants to facial recognition tools, which rely on or involve algorithms. So one approach to examining the problems AI poses for privacy would be to examine a specific AI-powered technology. So we might think of privacy implications of a deepfake or of a large language model. What we're going to do today is think more generally about the problems that AI poses for privacy by examining their use of algorithms. So an algorithm is a set of rules or instructions that can be followed to solve a problem or achieve a task. So it consumes outputs, it consumes inputs, and produces outputs. So you can think of this set of rules as rules to obtain the expected output from a given input. So, for example, you might train an algorithm to detect X-ray scans with signs of cancer and give as inputs X-ray scans and have as outputs only those scans with signs of cancer. Or you might train an algorithm to rank CVs on the basis of some predefined criteria, such as someone's skills or experiences or some keywords, where the output of the algorithm is a score CV. So privacy problems here emerge on both the input and the output side of algorithms. So on the input side, we have concerns about data collection. On the output side, we have problems concerning the aggregation of data and also the ways in which information is used. Problem of consent is something that spans across both sides, and that's because it pertains to both the collection and the use of information. So we're going to start by talking about data collection. So one of the major problems that AI poses for privacy has to do with the collection of data about users without their consent. So many AI technologies rely on large-scale data collection to be trained, make predictions, or automate decisions. This industry of acquiring data has come to be known as the data economy. So we have companies called data brokers, which specialize in the commodification of data. So they collect personal data on internet users and then sell that data to insurance companies, banks, prospective employers, governments, or anyone else who's willing to buy it. So personal data for AI, and which is used to train AI, is gathered primarily in two ways. So either by scraping data from the internet, so public sources, or by repurposing customer or user data. So data is given for one use and it's used for a different use. It's worth recognizing as well that these AI-powered technologies don't merely collect, but also create data. So they make records where there previously were none. So algorithms on social media capture our preferences and emotional states. Smart home devices provide real-time data from our homes, and surveillance devices track what we do and where we are. So what's wrong with this data collection? Primarily the way in which this data is gathered can undermine users' privacy. So much of this data is collected without meaningful consent and with a lack of transparency. So practices such as data scraping contravene many established privacy principles, such as being transparent about personal data collection and use and preventing data use for unrelated secondary purposes. So for example, Clearview AI, when they developed their facial recognition tool, scraped billions of photos from social media, online profiles, and photography websites without seeking consent. So there we have a clear contravene of established privacy principles. So one of the major concerns about the availability of this of this personal information is that it makes us more susceptible to harm. So it puts users at risk of a range of negative consequences as a result of either access to or use of information. So, as I said at the outset, it's often not the case that AI introduces new problems, but rather exacerbates old problems. So data scraping, for example, occurred long before machine learning algorithms, but AI creates incentives to scrape more frequently and extensively. Moreover, even though it was possible to collect large amounts of data on individuals before the age of AI, this took huge amounts of human labor. So even if I could record a single individual constantly, we couldn't listen to all the audio captured, watch all the footage, or sift through the data gathered. What something like a large language model like ChatGPT can do for me is do this for me. So I give it an hour-long meeting, and that will give me a summary. Ask it to search through millions of conversations or organize them by topic. I will do that. So in this way, AI amplifies and increases the risk of harm. So it makes collection of and access to information easier. So that's the problem of data collection. Now we're going to turn to the problem of aggregation. So essentially, this concerns the ability of algorithms to make inferences about people, specifically the ability to take bits of non-sensitive information as input and infer sensitive information as output. So here we have Nissenbaum, who writes that the act of compiling information can transform harmless bits of information into a picture that can embarrass and hurt. So discrete bits of information can be conjoined with other bits to form rich portraits capable of revealing identity, personality, and lifestyle. So one well-known kind of demonstration of this problem concerns Target, which is a large retail store chain. So they developed an algorithm to identify pregnant women based on their shopping patterns. And the idea here was to encourage customers to see Target as their go-to for baby products. So a man complained to Target about his teenage daughter receiving baby-related advertisements, thinking that they were sent in error. He soon discovered that his daughter was, in fact, pregnant. So in this case, the algorithm correctly inferred that the woman was pregnant on the basis of innocuous data. So in this case, there was a correlation between pregnancy and the purchase of cotton balls, vitamins, unscented products. So there's a clear privacy issue at stake here. But what the Target example tells us is that algorithms can generate new data about people in ways that we might not expect. And this creates an interesting situation in which, even if the input data is mundane and collected by legitimate means, it can be used in ways that undermine privacy. So this brings out a distinction between kind of two ways of conceptualizing personal information. So we can have information which is intrinsically sensitive, and it's intrinsically sensitive if it's sensitive when considered on its own. So if people in a certain society have reasons not to want other people to know about that information alone. And then extrinsically sensitive information is information which is sensitive only if considered in combination with other data points. So for example, one's purchase of a cotton ball is not in itself sensitive, but when combined with other information, it can become sensitive. That's why it's an extrinsically sensitive information point. So this problem of aggregation complicates existing privacy issues in two important ways. First, it makes it difficult for us to predict which bits of data should be protected under the right to privacy. So we might wonder whether something like extrinsically sensitive data should have the same privacy protections as intrinsically sensitive data, given that it can potentially have similar consequences. The problem of aggregation also complicates the issue of consent. So given that it's difficult for me to know what information might be inferred from the seemingly mundane information that I'm giving away, it's harder for me to know what to consent to the revelation of. Once again, the capacity for inferences to undermine privacy doesn't seem to be a new privacy problem. So these kinds of inferences are possible. So I can infer that someone's embarrassed from flushed cheeks. I could predict the likelihood of someone developing cancer by their hefty smoking habits. But the kinds of inferences that are possible with these machine learning algorithms move beyond the predictions that humans are capable. So again, it exacerbates and complicates existing privacy problems. Okay, so finally, we're going to talk about the issue of consent. So consent is crucial in the context of privacy because it can transform the moral permissibility of an action. So it can make previously impermissible acts permissible. So right now, it would be impermissible for you to go and pick up my diary and read it. But if I were to give you consent to do so, that same act would no longer become a violation of my right to privacy. So one argument against the issues that we've raised so far is that data collection and aggregation just don't pose an obstacle to privacy because we consent. So we voluntarily carry phones in our pockets, we use social media, we agree to terms and conditions. But as several authors have noted, it's unclear that consent can be meaningful in privacy online. So we tend to think of meaningful consent as having two features, at least, being informed and being voluntary. So we'll go through these two in turn. So first is our consent to collection and use of personal information informed. The first obvious point to note is that terms and conditions are just notoriously difficult to understand. Often our consent merely requires clicking a button, and that doesn't guarantee that people have read privacy notices, nor that they understand the potential risks involved. The second reason to doubt that consent is informed is that big data is designed to reveal unforeseen correlations and inferences. And that implies that there's a significant degree of uncertainty about future findings. And that just complicates the extent to which users can be informed about how their data will be used. Now turning to whether consent is voluntary. So it seems true that many privacy problems could be alleviated by abstaining from the use of these technologies. But it's unclear that this response is very practical in the current digital environment. So most of us at least feel like to be fully functional members of society, we have to use some platforms like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and these force us to give up some of our privacy. It might be argued that just suggesting we stay away from these is too much to ask. It also seems as though it would involve discouraging citizens from participating in forms of public engagement, and perhaps as democracies, this is not something we want to do. Final factor which complicates consent online is the idea that privacy is collective. So there seem to be cases in which individuals lack the moral authority to give away personal data. So firstly, because our personal data can contain information about other people. So when we expose genetic information, we're exposing our parents, siblings, children. When we reveal location data, we're revealing information about the people that we work and live with. And when we disclose our psychological makeup, we're also exposing other people who resemble us. So in the Cambridge Analytica case, they collected data from 87 million Facebook profiles without proper consent, and only 270,000 Facebook users consented to the collection of their data. The other 87 million were friends of the consenting. So the collective nature of data kind of shows that even if we abstain from using these technologies, the people around us might implicate our privacy for us. The second reason why we might think of like sensitive information and privacy as being collective is that it can have collective consequences. So for example, when forms of micro-targeting undermine the collective good of democracy. So we should think, given that we're connected in ways that make us vulnerable to one another's privacy, we're in some sense responsible for protecting one another's privacy. Okay, so outline 3 problems, one concerning the collection of data, one concerning the problem of aggregation, and then thoughts a little bit about how consent might not function well in the case of privacy online. We're going to end with a few ideas of how we might protect privacy online. So one idea is that just given the harms that are liable to arise, we should collect only the bare minimum of data. Another idea is that we should ban institutions from using algorithms to infer sensitive data. So this isn't This isn't to say that there aren't any cases in which it would be justified. For example, inferences for medical purposes with informed consent of the patient might be justified. These inferences can be useful. Second idea is that we just limit the time over which data is stored. So the longer the data is stored, the more liable we are to harm. It's also worth noting that information can become extrinsically sensitive over time as our ability to make inferences from mundane information improves. Finally, we should adopt a granular approach to right waving. So some institutions seem to assume that once we've intentionally revealed information about ourselves online or given a bit of data to a company for some specific use, we've consequently waived all downstream uses to control information. But even if intentionally disclosing information might mean waiving some rights with respect to that information, it shouldn't mean that there are no privacy-related duties in place. So each of these measures would limit the possibility that others have to gain access to our data and use it in ways that might harm us. And that increases the control that we have over our personal data. So by increasing control and reducing access, each of these measures could increase privacy under both the control and the access accounts we considered at the outset. Okay, that is it. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to discussion.